Welcome everyone to our November webinar from the Student Success Analytics group at Educause. And today we have an exciting topic to discuss: data governance. Who owns student data? And we have some famous guests along. So we're very excited about today's webinar. Our guests are Melissa Barnett. And Melissa is Data Governance Manager at Georgia State University. She works at the Office of Institutional Effectiveness. Melissa is a data analytics professional, most recently from Boston, but living and working in Atlanta. As inaugural Data Governance Manager at Georgia State University. Now, she will be accompanied by Ravneet Chadha, Chief Data Officer from University of Arizona. Now, we look forward to their presentation, but just a couple of words about our community group. The Student Success Analytics Community Group is sponsored by Educause, and the goal, of course, is to promote, educate, and further a network of practitioners with a desire to improve student success through the use of analytics. The more we collaborate and share on these efforts, the easier it is for individuals to grow and succeed. Now, we have quite impressive numbers when it comes to being a community group. We send out newsletters. We have a Connect site. We'll share the site link in the chat in a few moments. We invite you to join us on the Educause Connect site. There you'll find various areas of interest, such as a library with some of publications that our community authored. We also have with us today some of the community members, some of the past community members as well. Welcome everyone. And just wanted to check in with Marcia Ham, our chair of the community. Hi, Marcia. So this takes us to the webinar itself. I'm going to stop my share, and we would like to invite Melissa and Ravneet.
Thank you, Simon. Let me get my slides here for you. There we go. And, oh, that's what happens when I do that. First of all, I didn't know that we were famous. That's quite an intro. I appreciate that. And thank you for having both myself and Ravneet. And as you see here, I have Ravneet as a special guest. Of course, he will be answering questions as well. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And I actually am going to answer two questions today. I'm going to start with, where do you begin? And I have that emphasis because a lot of people do ask me that question. And then, who owns student data? And on that point, we actually have, on that second question, we have several comparisons for you and contrasts between Georgia State University and the University of Arizona. As we just mentioned, Ravneet is the CDO there. And he was just talking before everyone joined that everything that is data related goes through his office. So he has a pretty large group there in Tucson. I wanted to give a little bit of background about Georgia State. I'm sure several of you know about it, given its role in student success and its journey to where we are today. The image that I have here is of a book about that journey. Not sure if you're familiar with it. It was published back in the fall of 2020, and it actually came out about a month before I started in this role, which is an inaugural role. And it's a wonderful documentation of the ups and downs of how they went through this process. And I typically like to read a book about the institution I'm working at to give me an idea of the culture. And given that this was a recent history, it was really wonderful to read, because I also got to see and read about many of the key stakeholders I work with on the governance side of things. And I will say that while they likely do not use, I don't recall exactly the word data governance in this book, a lot of what they were doing are several of the components of governance, looking at quality, searching for that data, documenting it, and of course, analyzing it for the specific questions that they were asking on the student success side. We are one of the most ethnically diverse institutions in the United States, and we have about 50,000 plus students. And so if you've ever been to Atlanta, the main campus is located in downtown Atlanta. And then we have 6 metro campuses. We consolidated several years ago with a area school called Perimeter College, and that is our 2-year if you will, wing of the larger institution of what we refer to as Georgia State today. The last thing I'll say is that if you didn't already know, which again with this group you probably do, Georgia State has been well known for utilizing data in this way to erase and or eliminate gaps in graduation by race ethnicity. A pretty monumental, I would say, feat on their behalf. And today, the individual who ran that team, Tim Rennick, now oversees the National Institute on Student Success. They have their own website. They are part of the university, but they are out there as in many ways a consulting arm for student success across the United States and world. Actually, they have several international I want to say clients as well. So you can check out their website. They have a lot of information there as well. So I want to give you a little bit of an idea of where Georgia State sits. And this isn't just because of the institution itself, but because it directly ties to data governance within Georgia State as well as with the system. So the University System of Georgia, these are all of the institutions here, their logos that you're looking at. You can see Georgia State here. We are one of 4 public R1s in the state. We've got Georgia State, we've got UGA, which is up in Athens. We've got my neighbor here in Atlanta, Georgia Tech, and then we have Augusta University. Augusta is our primary medical school in the state public-wise. Of course, engineering and STEM, many different areas at UGA as well as Georgia State. Now, why is this important? Well, back in 2019, the university system mandated that data governance be in each of the schools. In essence, in their they had to have a data governance program. And if you are so inclined, I don't have access to it right now, but if you were to look at if you were to Google the University System of Georgia's BPM, you would see that Chapter 12 details all of the items. Trust me, it's very long. It includes things such as definitions of the various roles in data governance, including stewards, who most likely in your institutions or you most likely work with the registrar and other units on campus that you need for student success analytic, utilizing that student data. And so by mandating it, this aided us, if you will. And I say that because many universities actually have various iterations of data governance, and we are on our 3rd. And this has been, I should say, our most successful iteration because this mandate has aided us. However, I want to say and highlight here that despite the fact of the mandate, the university system did not say you must do it exactly like this. Each institution has taken its culture into consideration, as well as its resources and what sort of data it happens to have. So, for example, Georgia State does not have any data that falls under HIPAA, but Augusta would. So you might find yourself in that situation as well, where certain regulations may or may not apply. So to my first question about where do you begin, I'm going to get a little bit into it a little bit further in. But I just want to say that if you are at the beginning, the very beginning, or even if you are revisiting it or your institution is revisiting data governance, it is always good to assess the landscape. I'll go a little bit more into detail about this in a moment. What I have here is a rather well-known maturity model. It has different stages. Typically down here is when things are exactly as it says, reactive. I would actually put up here towards the top, proactive, and then the various levels in between. Now, this is very good to know where you are, as well as how many iterations your school has had, because this typically, first of all, it gives you a lot of information of where you are in the moment, as well as how to benchmark yourself in the future. However, it also gives you a good understanding of where your the culture, staff, landscape, where they might be, if you will, mentally about data governance. Some areas it might fail. Some might have had it really, wonderfully well, but then, somebody wasn't leading it there for a while, or a pandemic comes along, and other things are at the top of mind. So it's a good idea to assess where you are, so you have an understanding where your institution has been, but it also helps you figure out where you need to go in terms of looking as you go each step of the way. Where have we come from is very, very helpful. I'll also say here that in many instances, this is quite a common phrase in data governance circles. There's formal governance, such as what we have at Georgia State and many other institutions. And then there are those that do it informally. What I mean by that is it's part and parcel of their process, but they don't necessarily have it documented, if you will, or people don't know exactly where to go or whom to go to for information. That's the more formalized aspect of it. Data governance tends to be a hard sell, if you will, for a lot of people, because people think that they are inventing something completely new. In some areas, they might be, but in a lot of ways, it's also documenting and providing guidelines for a lot of things that people are already doing. So I just wanted to let you know that as well. So before I actually click, I just realized here, and I wonder if hopefully this will work for me. It should. Take a moment and think about your own institution or the most recent institution that you worked with. Where would you say on this model, would you estimate that your current institution or the one that you most recently worked with, say on a project or so, where is their data governance? And hopefully when I click this next arrow, it will pull up a Slido. Oh, it does. Great. I was a little concerned. So all you need to do is you can go to slido.com or you can actually take that QR code and let's see where people are here on the call with data governance. I'm very interested to see here. Initial. I love when they move around. Okay. So there are, okay, most of you, and I'm assuming this is, we've got 7 people there. Oh, changing. Okay, I will wait. So right now, most people are at the initial stages, but there are some people who are at the top end of those levels 4 and 5 right here. But most people are at the beginning. I will say that in the data governance community group, which I lead the steering committee for that, and we have also a large committee there. Many of our members are also at those early stages. We have managed they're just flipping around, but a lot of people at the early stages, and we have been working on our the way in which we convey the materials for our attendees, because as they grow, we will, of course, change our materials, because things are different in the very beginning. So for those of you who are at some of these, if you will, more upper rungs, you've got the defined, just remind you, is level 3. This is level 5. Here's level 4. Some of this you may already be familiar with. But this, of course, is also from my experience, both at Georgia State, which I'll be sharing today, as well as from speaking for several others, not just in the community group, but also throughout the United States. Just making sure there aren't any questions here.
No,
Okay.
no questions. I'll
No.
interrupt you if I have a
Oh,
question. Yeah,
oh,
don't. We'll take
I
care of
appreciate
that.
it. Perfect. Thank you very much, Simon. I didn't realize that. So where do you start? So I've given you a little bit of information, but to reiterate what I just said again is assess the landscape. And I want to highlight the reason that I really am honing in on this is because of my experience at Georgia State. And I do realize that it's unique here, having had a mandate. But when I came in, it was just like a water hose. We had so many requirements to go through, so many people to get trained, so many deadlines to reach, that I didn't have at that time the bandwidth, because I am an office of one, to really assess the landscape. 3 years in now, I have a much better, I can actually take a step back. But in the beginning, it was very difficult to do that. So I want to reiterate that, because you might find yourself at an institution, or maybe you've been in this situation before, where people really want to get things up and running, and there's a lot of pieces moving. I really would, to the best of your ability, advocate for assessing the landscape, just getting a general sense of where you are. There's a variety of reasons for that, but I will say that one of them is, and I hear this time and time again, leadership typically wants metrics. They want to know how the program's going, and it's much easier to formulate metrics if you know where you've been, and what that foundation happens to look like, if you will, at the time of your entry or starting of the landscape. So these are the few elements that I'll highlight here that fall under assessing. Number one, what does your institution need now? And I highlight this because, as you can imagine, data governance has a lot to do with motivation. It also has a lot to do with building relationships and understanding what people need. And as you can imagine, some of those come in conflict with each other. What somebody needs over in one business unit might not be, maybe IT can't provide it, or it's in conflict with another business unit. I've heard this repeatedly from individuals about assessing what people need. And I want to say that I'm asked quite frequently to provide a roadmap, and people are typically looking for number one, then number two. Where do I precisely begin? And you really need to begin where your institution needs the help now. And in many cases, that's going to be in a particular unit or a particular type. So several schools will start with definitions, like we did, structures, et cetera, which is not, it's a fine place to start. But where I find a lot of schools starting is data quality in a specific area. And you're probably going to have your data, say you start at data quality, you'll want to get the definitions for some of those items, those specific items you're looking at, and also document standards before you start to move on to those more complicated issues of systems integration and then analytics, that individuals don't have to, as I'm sure all of you have experienced like I have, trying to find data in disparate locations, or people who might say you don't have access to it. All of that needs to be documented before you begin into those areas. You kind of have to tease it apart, but the exact and precise location you start really does depend on the need of the institution. This is something that a lot of schools, I think, don't think about. Are they actually ready to make the changes? And this isn't just about people and change management. You do have to look into that. You have to build, I know I say it a lot, and as do other people, to build those relationships, but it goes a long way. People will start bringing information to you once you do. But I also want to refer to this from an infrastructure standpoint. Maybe somebody or there's an institution that wants to make a jump up here, but where they are is here. And that needs to be known, and what it will take in order to make, if you will, that jump. There's a lot of, I see this in a lot of areas where people will want to jump to a technology or a platform to provide a glossary on, say, student and other definitions at the institution. But you need to make sure before you purchase a platform, and trust me, they aren't cheap, most of them, that are the people actually going to use it? Do you have them on board? Do they have the bandwidth? Do they have the ability? These are just some of the things you want to make sure before you go out and, say, make a large purchase, because they are large purchases. And finally, for this number one, you needed to develop a plan. Somebody said to me recently, it's like taking a listening tour, like presidents do. And while that might sound grandiose, there's some truth to that. You need to listen to people and take what they are saying and then make a plan. And maybe in some of your instances, it would be people listening to you as key analysts, and in other roles in institutions, because I do include analysts, I include IT, I include legal, cyber, all of those factors and those units in my discussions, because this is not just the data governance program. It is a collective effort. And then, of course, get feedback on that. I think too often people don't listen to maybe what the challenges are, or they could actually make something work a little bit better. This is absolutely key, is not just develop that plan, but seek the feedback. If you read the Educause review, which is the I think it's their sole magazine for the organization. Jason Simon and I, Jason is down at the University of North Texas. You might know him. We just had an article come out I think it was the end of last month. They just promoted it recently. And what we focus on here are some questions. I'm going to pull the first 5 up there just so you can scan them. And our argument here is that it is important to ensure that you have all the stakeholders part of the conversation. It's important that you have, say at least your mission. Some people will have a charter, and you'll have a small group of people who are, key in speaking about things and addressing things, whether it be to student data or other data on campus. But you also need to take your culture into account. And what a lot of people have told us they like about this article, here are a few of the other questions that we have. We have 9 questions. We provide 3 ways in which people can put it into practice. It is a longer read, as you can see here. It's 20 minutes. They do allow it. It can be read to you if you want to walk around the house or your office. But we do provide information on how you might go about and learn about your culture. I think we even have a phrase in there about, we know culture when we see it, but it's very hard to define. And again, we're not saying that this trumps or jumps ahead of those very needed items, such as, key stakeholders, your stewards, your trustees, and all of that other information, and the platforms and definitions. But this is very key to understanding and becoming even more effective at what you're doing and building at your university, as well as, to that point, about knowing your making sure that it goes well and that it's not an iteration that might be heard about down the road where people then might become resistant because they say, well, we did it before and it didn't go well. So it's very important to take your culture into consideration. This is the number 2 point. I hear this all too often about communication is lacking. And I have several ways in which I communicate to individuals. I communicate in terms of the mode of communication. I communicate in a variety of one-on-one meetings. I have quarterly meetings with my data stewards. I meet biannually with my data trustees. I have a lot of lunches. If anybody's familiar with Carruthers and Jackson in the UK, they have a newsletter called Coffee and Cake, which might sound cute, but actually their whole notion is they eat a lot of coffee and cake because they go out and they're talking with a lot of people. And part of this is just getting to know people and listening, part of that, if you will, listening tour. And these are some of the items that I argue you need to communicate. You need to be very clear on what data governance is and what it is not. Some have even advocated for changing the was going to say phrase, the title, because people get a little like, ooh, what are you going to govern? Somebody once called me a policewoman, by the way, and I'm not a policewoman. I'm very friendly collaborator and facilitator who happens to be knowledgeable of all of this. But you do want to communicate what it actually is. You also want to communicate why is it needed and why now? What is the risk of not having it, and being very concrete about that. You'll hear in a lot of instances that institutions will provide data governance once there's been a breach, and then the hair is on fire. I personally, that has to be stressful. That would not be an optimal way to begin. But you do need to explain to people, what are we getting out of this? And align that, of course, with what they need. That gets to that point. What's the risk? Universities typically talk about in risk and compliance, or how are we going to utilize and analyze the data to move the university forward? You tend to hear about risk and compliance from, in my experience, from Educause, and on the air side, you tend to hear about it more from the analytics and decision-making side, which I completely agree with both sides, and they need to somehow be in balance with one another, which is no easy task, by the way. You also need to communicate your expectations, time-wise, what they're expected. We at Georgia State have talked about potentially putting into job ads that this would be part of the role. That isn't something we've quite gotten in there yet, but I know some schools are looking into, you will have X% of your time devoted to this and what it will be. This also comes in trainings and regular communications. And finally, I have here just my most recent communication. Another communication I have, other than the datagov.gsu.edu website, is a bi-monthly newsletter that I have. I have taken to putting now recommended reads. I tell them about events and happenings, and I also use it for education. Not everyone clicks on them. I have a pretty broad audience. I have about 200 plus people on the email list here. And I make it very easy for them to hyperlink to things, et cetera. And I will note that this typically moves in the email. That's my culture. My culture is good with that. That might not translate in your culture. I by the way, started out with GSU pictures, and we have a wonderful collection. And I thought, I want a little more fun with this. And I've actually gotten great reactions from my audience. Again, won't work everywhere. That's why you need to craft your message. That's why I have this note here in mind. It's not, one message isn't going to work at every institution. It's also not going to work with every audience. So some final comments before we get to who owns student data. I want to just remind you that if you are in this position, whether it's possibly it's not your full-time position, but you are a part of it or you have connection to the program, there will be a need for reminders, monitoring, guidance. Georgia State, I'm very happy to say our trustees had the forethought and foresight to hire a singular individual for overseeing data governance. I think that is not just because I'm in the role, but I know from experience that it is absolutely needed, because when one person isn't in charge and leading it, it can fizzle out. And from my perspective, and I would hope from your perspective as analysts or predominantly analysts, that it would be important for you too. I will also say that if you don't know, before I flip to the next question, my prior work to being here at Georgia State was as an evaluation analyst at MIT, and previously prior to that at Harvard. And it was because of my struggle and the question we're about to talk about in finding the data. What does the data mean? Who do I have to go to, et cetera? What leadership keeps asking me, where are the answers? And I'm like, I'm trying to find the data, and it's in different formats. I absolutely empathize with all analysts, regardless of the focus of their analyses, because this is absolutely something that universities need to do to not only be in compliance and reduce risk, but also in order to move their universities forward in the various areas. So I just wanted to say that, that I wholeheartedly understand that, and that is ultimately my primary motivation for moving into governance, to be a solution, be a part of the solution. So we'll switch gears. So now imagine for a moment that you've gathered a small group of knowledgeable people on campus, not too large, not too big. Maybe you've been part of one of these small groups, and you're discussing governance, and the group decides to begin with 3 broad domains: student data, research administration data, I should state, and operational data, HR, finance. And then somebody asks, drumroll, who owns student data? My first response as a data governance professional: what do you mean by ownership? And what do you mean by student data? Student data does it involve just grades? Does it involve LMS data? Does it involve admissions and financial aid? What about disciplinary actions or health and counseling? Now, in the data governance world, at least at Georgia State, we have different stewards over those areas or buckets of data that I just talked about. And we also have a structure given to us by the USG, our system of the system of Georgia, where our president at each of their respective institutions that I showed you previously are they are the data owner. I apologize. Not the best title, but he owns or she owns the data. That individual names our data trustees, names our data stewards. And as you can imagine, we have a handful of those individuals who are over student data. Not all universities have this structure. And I will say that sometimes, even though they might explicitly state in some institutions that the university owns the data, not the individual areas, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what it looks like in practice. So what does it look like in reality? So here we have Georgia State on the left-hand side and Arizona on the right. Georgia State, and this is also why I very much wanted Ravneet to be part of this conversation, because not only does he have a lot to add on this slide, but also others. And I'm sure he has a lot to say. So I'm going to go through the Georgia State side and then turn it over to him to start our discussion about Arizona, as well as student data in general. Georgia State is a very, it is a very large institution, but it is not an overwhelmingly, I would say, if I looked at the org chart compared to other institutions, it's pretty straightforward. So we have 8 domains. What I mean by that are big buckets of data. We've got development, we've got, like finance and HR, and those operational components. We have research, but we have 2 student units specifically because of what I said earlier, which is not the same at every school. We have a student success / enrollment group, and we have a student engagement group. We do have people that, like I said, are over those areas, those data stewards, but for all intents and purposes, these 2 here, these 2 primarily focused data areas that I mentioned, there isn't really that much conflict or challenges for them. There are a few instances where I will say, and let's see if that's my next bullet point. Yes, I'll get to that. The part of it is that the one challenge we have is that in some areas, well, in all areas, though in some areas more so than others, they use the principle of least privilege. Part of this also comes down to if you work with financial aid data and you're doing any sort of analyses on students and financial, say, outcomes or debt or whatever the case might be, who gets and who is able to have that data does depend on the person who is overseeing the data, that data steward. He or she is able to determine who gets that data. And they are actually, from a regulation side of things, they tend to be more highly regulated than other aspects, right? Like say FERPA is regulated, but some of the sides with GLBA, which is the primary financial regulation, they just have different requirements. We also speak of data in the abstract. What I mean by that is you probably have data in your student information system, but it's not just student information. It's probably also financial aid data. There are other sorts of ways in which various data assets are configured. So it's not as if in every instance, a singular data steward is over a whole data asset. In this case, that's what I mean by the abstract. It is that bucket of data, and more specifically, when you drill down the specific type of student data, who has that oversight, who actually sets the rules for that, what's the processes and the documentation and training that someone might need to go through in order to get that data. That is heavily documented at Georgia State, and they go through that various process. So in essence, as I'm saying here, our SIS includes 2 data stewards, so student data would fall into different buckets, but depending on who you are, and if they believe that you need access on a regular basis, it depends on what sort of access you'll get. And as I said a moment ago, the stewards use the principle of least privilege. And what that means, of course, if you're not familiar, is giving you just what you need in order to fulfill the, say the report writing that you're doing or an analysis that has been asked. So that is our approach. And I will say there just have been a few pieces, a few times where people get a little itchy about stuff, but not like I've heard that can happen. And now I'm going to pull up Arizona.
Thanks, Melissa. Thank you for having me here. And it's good to meet or see a lot of you here. To start off, who owns student data? I would say that is the hardest question for folks who are in the data realm. because I tell this to my team every day, that you can put all of institutional data except for student on one side of the scale. I think the student data will still outweigh it just based on complexity, the amount, the individuals that you have to interact with, and also because there is a lot of sensitive information in there that makes it harder to sometimes manage. So at University of Arizona, especially in our office, which is called University Analytics and Institutional Research, we handle over 30 different data sources that include 9 enterprise systems. So what I mean by enterprise systems is our SIS, our HR system, finance, research data, and all, and then also our CRM. From that perspective, I would say our SIS system is the hardest one, but what also is, I would say, something that we do it for better or for worse. When we talk about student data, we would encompass SIS. We would encompass our LMS. We would encompass our, for example, advising notes that we take in our CRM, right? So to us, all of that is a student data. So I think that's the piece that is not included in here, that those are different sources. But as an enterprise system, we are considering SIS as one and our CRM as one. And then we bring in different information from our, for example, cultural centers and events that are organized by them. We use that for different analysis, right? So if you want to use any sort of information about what's the likelihood of a student graduating who attends more cultural events on campus versus not. So we have the capability of doing that and just bringing that and integrating that information in the warehouse, and then doing the analysis on top of that is something that our office does. Moving on to the access to the student data in itself, who owns it? I tell this to people on campus all the time. I am not the owner. That's the very first piece that I always tell people. I'm not the data owner. I'm a custodian. And on top of that, I manage and I own the reporting system. So how access works at Arizona is you have an individual who joins the university, let's say, and they want access to class enrollment, right? And those are dashboards and reports that have already been set up in our reporting environment. When they put in a request to get access to that, the very first step is me as an approver for them to get access into the reporting system and get them access to that particular dashboard or set of dashboards that come with that role. I will review that particular piece and say, okay, this is what their role is. I can see them needing access for their job to, or for them to have access to these dashboards to do their job in a better way, right? Once I approve it, it goes to the data steward. Then they will approve that if this individual should have access to the data in itself or not. I gave approval on the system. They gave approval on the data in itself. And at any point, I can deny it or they can deny it if we don't necessarily think that they should have access to it. Or we can say, hey, you asked for this access. This doesn't work for you. You actually need a different role. Or completely, we can say, you know what, you just need aggregated data. You don't need at the student level. So just use the reports that are already out there at the level that you need it at. So those are the things that goes through it. And then, again, from a subdomains perspective, admissions, student records, class enrollments, advising, LMS, anything around student success metrics that people might be collecting separately that are not part of the enterprise system, we will bring them in. So how I think this came up earlier, Melissa, you talked about the data ownership. How I tell people what data ownership is, it's based on the individual who actually owns the system of record. So for example, within our student data, within our SIS, right, there are folks who manage the financial aid of data sets. Then there are folks who manage enrollment, and there are individuals who manage class enrollment. So for class enrollment, Registrar is the owner, right? For admissions piece, our admissions office, sorry, I have this AI thing set up on my thing that it automatically throws up. So don't be surprised if the balloons show up pretty soon here. I don't change it because I think it makes meetings fun. Anyways, so then you have admissions folks that are data stewards for the admissions data. Then you have individuals who are on the student success side that become data stewards for that. So we have roles set up that would follow through a different workflow depending upon the data domain in itself. In terms of our users, I would say currently we are, just from high level numbers, just under 52,000 students, around 15,000 employees. Out of those 15,000, 2,500 odd employees are provisioned to access student data at any point in time at different levels. Obviously, some will be super granular, some will not be, some are more high level. And that is something that we do here. We, I would say, are a lot more transparent from a data perspective than some of the other schools that we've talked about, or I have talked to. We have 13 different roles that are created just for the student data piece. And we go through an audit process every year. We work with data stewards to get the definitions and things like that. So within our team itself, our analysts know if somebody is looking for a data set or if somebody wants to create a new report for institutional need and we have to put it out for public, we know that this role would be the best suited for that as well. So from a data governance perspective, it helps us understand why we're putting out a new data set, for what population, and how people can access any of that information. So I think that's how reporting has been set up at the University of Arizona. And we've been doing this a little over 15 years at this point now. And I think we've come a long way in terms of the number of users who actually use data on campus. I would say we are very data hungry campus. People want everything at all times and all of that. So that's why I think the way we are set up might be a little different, but we go through all of the processes that we need to take care of to ensure the privacy and the sensitivity around student information is maintained throughout, because I think that is one big piece for us.
So as you can see, there are different experiences between campuses, also the way we've structured things. But I will say too, to Ravneet's last point, privacy is also something here at Georgia State that is also being mandated. They amended that chapter on that business manual I was telling you about. But from that perspective, our cybersecurity is overseeing that, and governance is part of those conversations. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Q&A. I haven't been looking at the chat. I depended on Simon, so I assume that Simon, are there any questions in the chat there for Ravneet or myself?
Yeah, so we've been discussing in the chat kind of questions and answers.
Okay.
I think Marcia brought a really good topic. To what extent do students own the data when the data is created by students, also part of conversations as to what the data is itself? Have you considered kind of a partial ownership and maybe looking at the rights of the user, not necessarily viewing it as ownership, but as a rights to control data?
So Ravneet might have a different structure at Arizona, but at Georgia State, we have, because of that privacy component that I was just telling you about, our cybersecurity is required to have what is called, you might have heard, some people will call it a DSAR. It's a data subject request, where if a student wants their data to be removed from the system, they have to go through a process, and then they have to be, of course, verified, and then they can go through that process and request it, and the information can be removed. Now, the challenge comes from when it's in a student record, right? There are, of course, at least here at Georgia State, there are certain retention schedules. And when it comes to student records, they are kept for the life of, I think they're kept in perpetuity. They're kept forever. But certain other components surely can be removed. We have received requests about removing, say, images or other components. So they do have a right to have that removed. And I know at other institutions I've been at, and I can't imagine that this wouldn't be at Georgia State either, but I know at other institutions that students can refuse to have their information included in the directory. Of course, there, as you can imagine, there's a variety of reasons why students might want that, but there are more and more privacy laws that are making this more at the forefront, and universities are getting their processes in line. But it is quite an undertaking, as you can possibly imagine. Ravneet, do you have something different at Arizona?
I would say different processes to accomplish the same goals. For example, one of the things that recently, I'll share an example, we started capturing the gender information I think in 2020, right? Because with everything happening, that was something that we had to do. Before that, we only captured binary sex for our student and employees. So one of the things that we did is that is an optional information that somebody wants to give, and you have the capability of checking the box that don't include me or whatever else we want to do there. So we keep that in mind. We've always had these what we call it flags that an employee or a student can select with an actual reason, not just because they don't want to be found, but with an actual reason to explain why they should not be showing up in a phone book, right? Or they should not be, they can be shown in the reports, for example, but their contact information should be hidden from people. So we have done a lot of that work. And I think it's just one of those things that depending upon where the conversations are in the society, or, unfortunately, there are instances that happen that push us towards creating a process that helps us kind of establish privacy for the individual. And I'm not talking about privacy from a data standpoint, but just if an individual needs to be a little bit more private for a specific reason, we have figured out ways to do that in our, I would say, enterprise systems. One of the things that I'll share is I've talked to some of the other schools that they do this after the fact. So they maintain a separate list where then they pass that information on to somebody else, right? So what happens with that is it becomes a very manual process. So what we push for is we're going to push that into enterprise system that somebody can go in, provide reasoning and check the box, and then it automatically gets taken care of from a process standpoint. So we're not necessarily, sending a list to Melissa to hide me, right? So it's basically, I just make the change in the system itself.
Thank you. May I just add, we just have a few minutes left, and there's a few questions that were added. Melissa, would you mind if we don't get to all the questions, I will send them to you, and then maybe you can respond, and we'll send it to participants as a follow-up if we don't get to all the questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So a question from Kimberly. How are requests handled when a unit wants to employ AI-powered analytics tool or an app that wants to import, stream, or allow bidirectional updates for the data to help improve the student experience? So it's not just an individual or team that wants to the data for a vendor or tool.
So
how are the requests handled, I guess, in this new age of AI where new functions are added? Do you have a process, or maybe you apply the existing process for the AI power analytics?
So I know that one of the questions Simon and I were talking about prior to this meeting is AI policy. We do not currently have a policy around AI. I will say that it's relative newness, has a lot of institutions looking into this. And I can imagine also from the IT side of things, since I said earlier, or Simon mentioned that I'm on the business side, if you will, of the house. So we do not yet have a policy. Our requests right now, I wish they were centralized for, say, and I guess the way the question was phrased, I'm assuming it's like a data stream, as opposed to, say, a flat file or anything of that nature. I would assume, from my experiences there, that they would need to go through probably our, say it's student data from Banner, which is our SIS. They would have to go through that team, and particularly the DBAs there, to access the information. I know from experience, even just getting into being able to see screens of, the form side of data in Banner has multiple hoops. And I can imagine that the stream of data, like a flow of data, would be the same. But I am not part of those processes at this time.
And do you think there would be a difference for an app vendor versus just an individual making a request?
The difference between a vendor?
Yeah, a vendor or an application that comes in versus an individual working on their own.
Well, so I will say that Georgia State has a pretty rigorous process when it comes to say a unit on campus wants to purchase a new application. It actually has to go through, it's required by the system to go through a cybersecurity review and a legal review. So the vendor actually has to go through these various hoops before it can even be put into the process of purchasing. So they do have those agreements written up, data sharing agreements, and also destruction of data once in regards to a vendor. We do not have, and I've only heard of a few schools that have this, of data sharing agreements between units or individuals, if you will, in-house. But with vendors, absolutely.
Thank you. Another question from Dan says, have you found the term data owner to be helpful, useful in certain respects, or has it perhaps contributed to confusion or reinforcement of data fiefdoms, silos? When our institution established our modern data governance framework a few years back, there was a very intentional move away from the term owner in favor of articulating roles, responsibilities of trustees, stewards, and custodians.
Yeah, the owner was not my choice. Like I said, the system required that the data owner would be the president. It is problematic. There are several institutions who do not utilize that term for all the reasons specified. If I have to say, I'm not sure what I would call then that individual role there, because clearly we need a person who has the final, I guess, step of responsibility. What we tend to use instead is we talk about it as stewards have oversight for their given functional area and the data that falls within that area, and they own the definition, but they do not own the data. And because we have a data owner, we've been very specific about that. And that has aided us, especially when it comes to, for example, colleges will think that they own the student data when in fact it's actually the registrar. So she owns then the See, I just used it there. She has oversight for it, but she owns the definition. They believe that they can define it, but that's not the case. And we have established that they are, in essence, data users of the registrar's data that she oversees, but she still owns the definition. And sometimes she has to work with them because they have very specific codes for various parts of the curriculum, etc. But she still is that final, further up, if you will, individual who has oversight for the data, but she owns the definitions, but she does not own the data. Again, I said earlier that some schools have been very specific about that the institution owns the data. So you could say that some entity needs to own the data. Somebody needs to be the final stop. But I do think it probably does whether it's explicitly or not, it definitely sends that message of what you're saying about fiefdoms. And we do need to slowly but surely get away from that. And it won't be overnight, but I think it matters.
Well, thank you so much. We still have one question from Helen and Jasmina, and we'll forward those to you. But thank you so much for such a interesting and thought-inspiring conversation and your presentation. So, Ravneet and Melissa, thank you again so much for accepting our invitation. And we invite you to our discussion forum on our Educause website. And say, Marcia, did you want to add anything as a closing note?
No, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I think there's so much more to communicate about, and I look forward to more synergies between our community groups in Educause, and welcome anybody to join our community groups, both the Student Success Analytics and the Data Governance CGs through Educause. Thank you, everybody, for attending today.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.